Hello, this is Ziemowit About History, and today I will tell you how climate events shaped the history of humankind. In this movie, I will point you how the great natural disasters and natural events shaped the history of mankind. And it's not the great generals, the great kings, the glorious empires that shaped our history, but rather natural events like volcanic eruptions, ice melting, and earthquakes shaped the history of mankind. Today I will prove you that the Ice Age was crucial for developing human civilization and that great volcanic eruptions completely changed history, the course of history, as in ancient times as well as in medieval and modern history. And finally, I will also tell you why Islam is a byproduct of climate change. Not the will of Allah, but climate change caused that Islam spread on the great scale in the globe, and today it's the second greatest religion. So stay with me, and today we'll talk about climate that shaped the history of mankind. We have this strange anomaly on our planet Earth that sometimes a lot of land is covered by ice. And this glaciation is coming back periodically through our planet history. And what's very important, this cycle was discovered by Serbian mathematician and scientist Milankovitch, and today we call this Milankovitch cycle. And he figured out that glaciation on our planet is caused by the change of axis of Earth, which sometimes leans more towards the sun, then it is generally warmer on Earth, and sometimes it tilts up to 22 degrees, and then the poles receive less sunlight, cool down, glacier capes are formed, which reflect more and more sunlight because they are white, and this is how glaciation is fueled. That's why we had great ice on planet Earth 20,000 years ago. It was the peak of the last ice age. And after this date, 20,000 circa years ago, the climate changed and became warmer and warmer and warmer, so the ice was melting. And finally, 11,000 BC, the climate was quite warm, the glacier was very thin and quite small, but then the great asteroid hit Northern America, and we precisely know it was around 10,750 BC when this collision took place, and the great cloud of dust covered the sky, and again climate became much colder, and for another few hundred years the Ice Age came with its all power. So the first human civilization, the civilization of Göbekli Tepe, the people who built these great monuments in present-day Turkey, they disappeared. Their civilization collapsed because of this great cosmic event that caused the Ice Age to become more and more severe for them. And this short period of new, very cold climate we called the Younger Dryas. After it passed, the climate became warmer and warmer and was coming to this position that we have today. Melting of this great glacier was a dramatic event itself. Imagine ice thick of 5 kilometers even in Scandinavia, and it holds a lot of water in it. It was millions of cubic meters of water, and this water was melting and it was spilling to the ocean, and also, especially in Eurasia, it was spilling to the great basin of Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. You have to remember that in the peak of last ice age, the ocean level, global ocean level, was lower over 100 meters than present. So the amount of land in the world was much bigger than we have today. So this great amount of water was filling the ocean, and the sea level was going up, up, up and up. But in this great Eurasian basin, where the Black Sea is today and the Caspian Sea, the water have no place to escape. And this great lake, post-glacial lake, was connected. The Caspian Sea and the Black Sea was connected, and the sea level was here much higher than it is today. Scientists estimate that the level of Black Sea during this great melting was even 50 meters higher than today. And suddenly, in one point of time, this great amount of water reached the barrier of Bosphor Strait, and the water spilled over this rocky ridge and connected with the Mediterranean Sea, at first causing a great waterfall that was flowing the water for years probably. So this great amount of water connected with the Mediterranean Sea, and the global ocean suddenly also get more water and the level rise. And this was the first dramatic event in Bosphor Strait, when the waters of Black Sea that were much higher than the global ocean spilled into the Mediterranean. As the water went to the Mediterranean Sea, then this waterfall stopped, and Mediterranean was still much lower than that the Black Sea was. And then climate was warmer and warmer, and this lake, Black Sea, was becoming smaller and smaller and smaller because the water was evaporating, and the amount of water flowing there from the rivers was not so big. So this lake was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We are talking about around 7,000 years BC. But the global ocean, on the other hand, was constantly rising as the glacier was melting. And finally, there was another dramatic event when the waters of the Mediterranean Sea flow over the Bosphor Strait, and now the water was spilling into the Black Sea basin. And it was in the beginning of Neolithic agricultural revolution. And we can imagine that on the coasts of this small Black Sea, in fact, small Black Lake, there were a lot of human settlements, because this land was very suitable, flat for agriculture, and the soil was fertile. But suddenly waters from the Mediterranean spilled into the Black Sea basin, and the level of the sea was rising very rapidly. And this caused these people to escape from this territory. They left all they have. Maybe they even built some ships to survive this flood. And the echoes of this great dramatic event are still present in the collective memory of humankind as the myth of Great Flood. And take also into account that the great holy mountain Ararat is located near the Black Sea. Around 5,000 years BC, we have climatic optimum in Europe. The climate is very warm and humid, and it's very good for agriculture. So in this 5th, 4th millennium BC, we have very big explosion of Neolithic cultures in Europe. First Neolithic civilizations on our continent start. For example, culture of Vinča in Balkans, the first known development of writing, copper metallurgy, great pottery. This is a civilization that begin in this very good Neolithic climatic optimum. And also in the great Ukrainian plains, another civilization started, civilization of Kukutani Tripole culture. They built cities holding thousands of people. The biggest Kukutani Tripole city was 50,000 men big, and that was the biggest human settlements on earth at this time. So as you can see, this climatic optimum was very influential on development of these early Neolithic cultures, and they could thrive. But of course, in history, everything has its end, and this end came in the middle of 2nd millennium BC. On the banks of Mediterranean Sea, especially on Crete, on this long island near Greece, there was a great Minoan civilization. Seafaring people, very rich, traders, connected with all the corners of Mediterranean world. And near their main island, Crete, on Santorini, great volcano erupted. It was around 1600 BC. And this great volcanic eruption caused great tsunami, and all this civilization was wiped out in one single day. And this caused also great change in weather, because all this ashes and dust from this great, one of the biggest eruptions in human history, they covered the sky, and of course the sun was unable to pass through these clouds, and the climate was much colder in the following decades and even centuries. And another great eruption occurred in 1159. This time it was Hekla volcano on the Iceland, and this great eruption caused another volcanic winter and sudden cooling of the temperature in Europe, and the people living on Balkans and on the northern shores of the Black Sea were suddenly unable to live thanks to their agriculture. So they have to move somewhere to survive. And therefore, that's why we have great invasion of sea people who first conquered Mycenaean Greece civilization. Hittite Empire in Anatolia also collapsed in the middle of 12th century BC, and they reach as far as Egypt and Palestine. Palestine is called after the Philistini, the tribe from this seafaring people that settled there and created their kingdom. Assyrian Empire was also affected by this invasion, and Egypt was also struggling with them, but Egypt was so far away in the south and was still so strong that they were able to repel this invasion. As you can see, this great political change on ancient Mediterranean basin was caused by completely natural events like volcano eruptions. The great conquests of Roman Empire were also caused by weather, because in the beginning of Common Era, the weather in Mediterranean basin was very good, and all Europe was a bit warmer than normally. So Roman legions used to hot Italic weather was able to conquer territories in the north, even Brittany, because in British Islands the climate was much better than it was in the future. So Roman legions were able to stay there, and this was not shocking for them, and the winters were not so harsh there, so they were able to hold these territories for few centuries. And then, after the greatest extension of Roman Empire in the beginning of 2nd century AD, the climate was slowly colder and colder and colder. So the barbarians in the north had to struggle much more to gather crops and to sustain their economy. So their pressure to move further south was bigger and bigger, and that's why they were constantly invading the Roman Empire with the new waves of barbarians, because the climate was changing and the weather was colder and colder. And this was very slow progression toward cold, but everything changed in the 6th century, because in the 6th century took place great dramatic event. In the year 536, great volcano Tavurvur, located north of Australia, erupted, and this was colossal eruption that changed the climate on the whole globe. Great amount of ash and dust was covering all Earth, and the year was without summer. Both in China, in Ireland and in Greece, everywhere people wrote some evidence about this enormous event. For example, in China they wrote that in August there was snow and the snow was brown. Also in Ireland they call it the year without summer, because it was cold the whole year. And that's why, of course, crops didn't grow, and was great problem with food, and a lot of people were dying because of starvation caused by this volcanic winter. And after this first very catastrophic event, this volcanic winter lasting for a year, and other years were also very cold, and this lack of food caused great disease in Europe. It was called a disease of Justinian the Great, and this sickness caused like 20% of people living in the Mediterranean basin to left this earth. And 15 years later, another wave of this disease attacked the Mediterranean, and another about 20,000 people perished because of this sickness. So it was another catastrophic event that was very good for Slavic tribes who invaded Europe from the north, because on Balkans, for example, there were much better conditions for agriculture. Keep in mind that we have much colder climate than today, because this climate change after this Tuvurvur eruption. So they had to move south to conquer new territories, to settle new lands for agriculture, and they came to Balkans that were occupied by Byzantine Empire, and the Balkans were unable to defend them because of these diseases, and also the population was very sparse because of this famine and this disease. So Slavic colonization of Balkans was very rapid and very successful, and Slavs marched as far south as Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, and Slavic genes are present in these territories up to today. So this changed the shape of Europe forever, and also it was a time when Islam started, because this cold period caused Arabic Peninsula to become much more fertile, because before that it was sandy, it was very hot, dry area. But now, when the climate changed and became much colder, Arabian Peninsula became fertile, partly green land with much more raindrop, and now they had quite good conditions for agriculture. So they were able to feed their horses, and they were able to expand demographically very rapidly. And that's why in the beginning of 7th century, when they had new ideology, Islamic religion, they erupted from this peninsula very rapidly, and they were able to conquer very vast area of Asia, Europe and Africa in 1 century only. And they created Umayyad Caliphate, that was the biggest empire created up to this time by humans. And this is because the Tuvurvur eruption and this dramatic change of climate on the whole earth, and this change was very beneficial for Arabs living on this normally desert Arabian Peninsula. But to be honest, there was also one important reason that the Arabic expansion was so rapid, because they at first they crushed 2 very important empires, Byzantine Empire and Sassanid Empire in Mesopotamia. But these empires were very weak at this point, because they were struggling in very long bloody war in the beginning of 7th century. And as this war stopped, immediately after, in 30s and 40s of 7th century, Arabs came and they erupted in very great numbers, never seen before. Numbers of their cavalry was like 20, even 30,000 men. And this was very big shock both for Byzantine and for Sassanid commanders, and as they were unable to withstand this great invasion, these 2 empires collapsed. The Sassanid Empire collapsed totally, and Byzantine Empire was cut in half, and the rest of the Byzantine Empire was barely able to withstand this great Arabic wave. And now we have the beginning of 8th century. Arabs and their new Islamic religion is conquering vast territories in the world, and in 717 they finally try to conquer Constantinople and destroy Byzantine Empire. But from the year 717 to 718 the winter is very hard and Arabs are unable to breach walls of Constantinople. But on top of that, in the year 763, another volcano in Iceland erupts and another volcanic winters covers the sky of Europe. And in this year, in this winter following this year, the Black Sea froze completely and the Bosphorus Strait was completely frozen for whole winter, and this situation was completely shocking for people living there because they never witnessed such a harsh cold conditions. And of course, for them, they didn't know that all this volcanic winter is caused by eruption on Iceland, so they thought that the god is angry on them, so they were praying, they were fasting, they were donating money to the church, so the god will change. So they wanted God to change his anger, and so the climate could be a bit warmer. But climate was becoming warmer very slowly, and even in the beginning of 9th century, precisely in the year 829, Nile River in Egypt was frozen for the first and, as we know, for the last time in history. Frozen Nile in year 829 was the peak of this cold period in the early medieval history of humankind. But later, finally, climate got warm, and in 10th century we have the beginning of a small medieval climatic optimum. The temperature was higher, the agricultural conditions in Europe were much better, and it caused a lot of events. First of them was great Viking expansion in the west. First they colonized Iceland, land of ice, but at this time it was quite good for settlements. But soon after, Eric the Red discovered Greenland, and they colonized this great land in vast numbers. And Greenland, as the name shows, was really completely different land that it is today. They call it so because there were a lot of trees, a lot of pastures for their cattle and for their horses, and even today we have a lot of evidence of Viking settlements on western, eastern and southern Greenland coasts. Thousands of men and women came there to settle and to thrive. And after colonizing Greenland, Leif Erikson sailed farther west and he discovered America, North America, and also Vikings created settlements in America, but probably because of hostile relationships with Native Americans, Scandinavians that settled in America were repelled, and these colonies did not stood for long, and for another half millennium America was free from invaders from Europe. The other aspect of this good climate conditions in the medieval period was demographical boom in Europe and crusades, because European knights were able to conduct numerous crusades to the Near East, to Palestine, to liberate the Holy City, because the good, fertile climate was enabling them to get more children and to send these young knights to fight for glory in the foreign lands. And so for another 150 years there will be a lot of great expeditions east to conquer Holy Land, and it was possible just because the good climate in this period of time in Europe. But this climate also brings the great invasion from the east, because also in the eastern great steppe on the Mongolian plains, climate was also much warmer and much milder in this period. So these hard Mongolian tribes, who were used to live in very cold winters and in very warm and dry summers, now they experienced much better conditions. So they also exploded demographically, and they were so numerous that they were able to conquer almost whole Eurasia, and the Genghis Khan, their great leader, was not the cause of the great Mongolic conquest, but he was the byproduct of this great demographic eruption that took place in the eastern Eurasian steppe. And this climate, this nice warm period, ended in the 15th century, and after the end of medieval times we have a small ice age in Europe that was until the 19th century. And in 19th century, when climate was warmer and warmer, we have last great cataclysm on Earth. We have eruption of Tambora volcano far in the Asia in year 1815. And Tambora eruption was probably the biggest volcanic eruption in the human history. And this eruption caused such a hard volcanic winter that the following year, 1816, was a year without summer. In summer months, temperature was very low, sun was all the time clouded by the different very dark clouds, and the snow was falling color rose, color bourbon, color burgund, and color brown. There was very different snow than normally. It was volcanic snow, in fact. And this event, this Tambora eruption, slowed the warming of climate for another almost 100 years. But it also gave the impulse to improve agricultural techniques because of lack of food that was caused by this volcanic winter. So as Europeans mainly were able to invent better agricultural techniques, in following years they produced much more food when the climate became more mild again. So they had in following years demographical explosion, because great number of food, no starvation, good living conditions, warming climate caused the demographic boom in the middle of 19th century that caused, in consequence, the great industrial revolution, because in villages, in farmlands, there were a lot of free people willing to work, and people in cities created factories that absorbed these peoples from rural territories, and they were working in these factories very hard for very little money, and this industrial revolution changed the way the humans live. It was second biggest change in human history. The first great change was the agricultural revolution in 10th millennium BC, around 10th millennium BC. And the second great revolution was the industrial revolution in the 19th century, when the way of living completely changed. But this change is, I think, a topic for complete another video. If you are interested in this, I would love to tell you about the great change of human behavior and way of living because of industrial revolution. For now, I would like to summarize that as human beings, as Homo sapiens, we experience a lot of dramatic change in weather. And throughout our history, climate changed suddenly numerous number of times, and we were able to sustain even these great volcanic winters and floods and earthquakes and periods of dry climate and period of very wet climate. And the climate change is something completely normal on our planet. So now we have just to adapt and prepare for that, for the climate that is changing. And even though the sun is our main factor of our climate and volcanoes are the second very important factor, and humans are not so important in the climate on Earth, because we are just like little ants on the great rock, and we are not a big players in this great universal game of climate on our planet. Thank you for watching. It was Ziemowit about history. Subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you in next videos. Bye!